Hello and welcome to today's Modern American series. In the last video, and if you didn't watch it, the link will be below. We talked about the election of 1960 and whether it was rigged. Today we are going to discuss both John F. Kennedy's domestic policies. Hold on. Today we are going to talk about his domestic policies, and then we will move on to his foreign policies. But his domestic policies boil down to a movement he called the New Frontier. So, John F. Kennedy's New Frontier. He deployed programs such as education programs, healthcare programs, and civil rights programs. He was known for exposing himself to smart groups of people, like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and economicist John Kenneth Galbraith. So these two people were in his cabinet, and so he surrounded himself with these smart people in his cabinet to go through these programs. So the Democratic so in his inauguration speech, he spoke of the torch being passed down to this new generation. And he was referring to this new generation of Americans, this new generation of workers, these new generation of working class Americans. And because we are really turning a page, because the civil rights movement is underway and the Cold War ended a few years ago. The Vietnam War is about to start. So we are entering this quote-unquote new generation. And what would we like to see in this new generation of Americans? So, the press loved Kennedy's news conference, and some later likened his administration to a mythical kingdom of Camelot and the court of King Arthur, the subject of a then popular Broadway musical. So, the press loved Kennedy. That's what that is saying. That's what that is speaking about. The press loved Kennedy. And he had such a important role to play. So we talked about his New Frontier programs being about education, healthcare, and civil rights. On economic issues, Kennedy had some success. He faced down big steel executives over a price increase he charged with inflationary and achieved a price rollback. In addition, the economy was stimulated by increased spending for defense and space exploration, as the president committed the nation to land on the moon by the end of the decade. So we see this economic boom that we have seen multiple times before in American history. So, but there's another economic boom, and it relates to space exploration. He wanted, his big goal as president was to see the first Americans on the moon. And this coincides with this space race we'll talk a little bit more about later on. So that was two big goals of his New Frontiir economic platform. There was an economic boom, and he wants to see the first Americans on the moon. So we are going to transition to Kennedy's foreign affairs. And there's a few sorry about that, guys. There's a few incidents we are going to talk about. With his domestic programs often blocked, Kennedy's increasingly turned his attention to foreign policy issues. In 1961, he set up the Peace Corps, an organization that recruited young American volunteers to give technical aid to developing countries. Also, in 1961, he organized the Alliance for Progress, which promoted land reform and economic development in Latin America. Kennedy did persuade Congress to pass the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which authorized tariff reductions with the recently formed European Economic Community of Western European nations. So he's becoming increasingly aware of foreign policy. Okay, let's break down his foreign policy with three big events. And many of you guys have heard these events before. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. These all happened under Kennedy. Let's start with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy made a major blunder shortly after entering office. He approved a CIA scheme planned under the Eisenhower administration to use Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. In April 1961, the CIA trained force of Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but failed to set off a general uprising as planned. Trapped on the beach, the anti-Castro Cubans had little choice but to surrender after Kennedy rejected the idea of using U.S. forces to save them. Castro used the failed invasion to get even more aid from the Soviet Union and to strengthen his grip on power. So these anti-Cuban people, these anti-Castro Cubans, Castro represents so this communist. So the U.S., the CIA operation called in these CIA trained no the CIA called in these Cubans to throw an uprising in the Bay of Pigs, and the plan got foiled and they had to surrender. And what did Kennedy do? Did not support. Threw his hands up. I'm not supporting them. I'm not saving them. They figure it out. So that's what his blunder was. So, covered the Bay of Pigs. Berlin Wall. Trying to shake off the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs defeat, Kennedy agreed to meet Soviet Premier Kozovic in Vienna in the summer of 1961. Kozovic seized the opportunity in Vienna to threaten the president by renewing Soviet demands that the United States pull its troops out of Berlin. Kennedy refused. So Kennedy refused to pull the troops out. In August, the East Germans, with Soviet backing, built a wall around West Berlin. Its purpose was to stop East Germans from fleeing to West Germany. As the wall was being built, Soviet and U.S. tanks faced off in Berlin. Kennedy called up the reserves, but he made no move to stop the completion of the wall. In 1963, the president traveled to West Berlin to assure its residents of continued U.S. support. To cheering crowds, he proclaimed, "Freedom has many different difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. As a free man, I take pride in the words, I am a Berliner." And this spread. The Berlin Wall stood as a gloomy symbol of the Cold War until it was torn down by rebellious East Germans in 1989. So, West Berlin built a wall around West Berlin. East many people in East Germany was fleeing to get out of the Cold War conflict. So let's pretend there's no wall, right? People in East Germany was fleeing to West Berlin to get out of the conflict, right? So what did West Berlin do? Build a wall around itself to stop people from getting in. West Berlin was a U.S. ally. East Germany was not. West Berlin, the president came to West Berlin and spoke, and we, as a free man, we don't need a wall around ourselves. So they took down the wall. Better picture now? No, there's red all over my thumb. Thank you, guys. Let's talk about something interesting, right? And you guys have heard this before, I hope. And if you haven't, we'll break it down. But it's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's very interesting and terrifying at the same time. The most dangerous challenge from the Soviets came in October 1962. U.S. recon planes discovered that the Russians were building underground sites in Cuba for the launching of offensive missiles that could reach the United States in minutes. So, we have the U.S. right here. Pretend that circle is like the outline of Florida and Louisiana. And Cuba. If you have not looked at a map, US and Cuba is pretty darn close to each other. So, the Russians were finding out Cuba was setting up missiles in Cuba that could reach the United States in minutes. So that's the game plan. Kennedy responded by announcing to the world he was setting up a naval blockade of Cuba until the weapons were removed. So he was setting up a stone cold blockade of Cuba until these were gone. A full-scale nuclear war between the superpowers seemed likely if Soviet ships challenged the U.S. naval blockade. After days of tension, Clausewitz finally agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for Kennedy's pledge not to invade the island nation and to later remove some U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a sobering effects on both sides. Soon afterwards, a telecommunications hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to make it possible for the leaders of the two countries to talk directly during the crisis. In 1963, the Soviet Union and the United States, along with nearly 100 other nations, signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to end the testing of nuclear war weapons in the atmosphere. The first step in controlling the testing of nuclear arms was offset by a new round in the arms race for developing missiles and warhead supremacy. So that was a very interesting crisis we found ourselves in. We are going to skip the flexible response segment in the textbook, but you can read it if you want. Okay, we are going to talk about something sobering now that we celebrate every year. We remember, we don't celebrate this fact, we remember. And that is the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. After just 2.5 years in office, President Kennedy's one brief shining moment was cut short on November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, as two bullets from an assassin's rifle found their mark. After the shocking news of Kennedy's murder, millions of stunned Americans were fixed to their televisions for days and even witnessed the killing of the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, just 2 days after the president's death. The Warren Commission, headed by Chief Justice Ern Warren, concluded that Oswald was the lone assassin. For years afterwards, however, unanswered questions about the events in Dallas produced dozens of conspiracy theories pointing to possible involvement by organized crime, Castro, the CIA, and the FBI. For many Americans, the tragedy in Dallas and doubts about the Warren Commission marked the beginning of a loss of credibility in government. So, there's countless conspiracies out there if you type in JFK's death conspiracy theories. But he was assassinated, and we remember that every year on November 22nd. At the time, John Kennedy's presidency inspired many idealistic young Americans to take seriously his inaugural message and to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. We talk in every time speeches are made, we talk about the running list of well-known American quotes, and that is one of them. You still hear it today. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. However, more recently, his belligerent Cold War rhetoric has drawn criticism from some historians. Nevertheless, the Kennedy legend had endured. That's it for the video on John F. Kennedy's New Frontier. Hope you stick around for the next video.